principles of the Australian parliamentary system are taken from the British parliamentary system known as the Westminster system. These principles are the foundations or the rules and practices that the Australian parliamentary system follows. In this video we'll look at 5 of them. We'll look at representative government, responsible government, the separation of power, the role of the Crown, and the role of the Houses of Parliament. When answering any questions associated with the parliamentary systems, firstly, try and avoid the use of the word in your definition or explanation. And secondly, you may need to adapt your answer to fit to the question. For example, if it's in relation to the Commonwealth parliamentary system, then you will need to write your answer in the context of the Commonwealth. Conversely, if it's in relation to the Victorian Parliament, then you'll need to write your answer in the context of the Victorian Parliament. Let's have a look at the first of those principles, representative government. This means that the government must make laws that reflect the views and values of that society. Remember, this is achieved through the process of elections. The electorate, those people who vote for government, will align themselves with the policies that best represents their views and will vote accordingly. If the government does not reflect those views or no longer reflects those views or the needs of that electorate, then they will be voted out or not re-elected at the next elections. The second of those principles that we'll look at is responsible government. Here, this means that the government is accountable. In other words, it's answerable to the people who elect it. They are ultimately responsible for the people, to the people, or to the electorate. But firstly, they are responsible to Parliament, and it operates through a system known as parliamentary responsibility, where ministers, who are those in charge of a portfolio or a department, are responsible for the actions of those departments. Should there be misuse or abuse of those powers, then this parliamentary system requires the member to resign. The third parliamentary principle is the separation of power. This refers to the arms or the functions of government, and that they are independent of one another. Let's look at the 3 arms. Firstly, there's the legislative arm, and this is the arm of government that is responsible for making law, and this power is held by Parliament. Secondly, there is the executive arm of government, which consists of government, ministers, or cabinet, and the Governor-General, if it is in the Commonwealth sector. The role of this arm of government is that they are responsible for the day-to-day administration of government. This is usually done through the public service or the departments. The third arm is the judicial arm, which refers to enforcement and application of the law. And this is done through the court system. It's important to note at this time that there is an overlap between the legislative and the executive function. Those members of the executive are also part of the legislative arm of government. So in some extent you could argue that there is no true separation. The aim of the separation of power is to ensure that there is no misuse or abuse of power. In other words, that no one body or institution has absolute control over all 3, which means that those who make the law are not responsible for implementing the law and are not there for judging the law. So this will ensure that there is no overlap and no misuse of power. The next principle is the role of the Crown. And this is generally seen in the legislative process. Australia is a constitutional monarchy, which means that the representative of the Queen, in this case, will take advice from his Prime Minister and Cabinet. Now, at this stage, we should be clear that there is a Commonwealth representative of the Queen, Governor-General, and a state representative known as the Governor. They both perform similar functions. Their main role in the legislative process is royal assent, which means that they give the Queen's approval for a bill, a proposed law, that's gone through both Houses of Parliament to become an Act of Parliament. Hence, the Crown will assent or consent to that bill becoming law. The Crown also performs another number of ceremonial duties, which are not part of the legislative process, but nevertheless are part of the role of the Crown. These include opening and closing Parliament, Head of State, and the Governor-General also holds what's called the reserve power. Finally, we'll look at the role of the Houses. Now, at this stage, we should talk about the structure of our Parliament. Australian parliaments have what is known as a bicameral parliament, with the exception of Queensland, which is a unicameral parliament. If it's a bicameral parliament, it means there are two houses of parliament, an upper and a lower, each having a specific roles to perform. So let's have a look at the lower house firstly. At the Commonwealth level, the lower house is known as the House of Representatives. At the state level, the lower house is known as the Legislative Assembly. Both perform similar functions. So remember to adapt your question, or your answer rather, to the question being asked. If it's in the context of the Commonwealth, then you should be talking about the House of Reps. If it's in the context of the Victorian Parliament, then you should be talking about the Legislative Assembly. So let's have a look at the roles. Their primary role is to make law, to initiate bills, to introduce bills for the peace and good order of the community. Secondary role is to form government. In other words, government is formed in the lower house. Those parties or political parties, known as a coalition, that has the majority of seats in this house will form the government of the day. Its third role is to represent the people. Hence, this house is sometimes referred to as the People's House. It acts as a forum for debate, where it can balance the views of the majority against the views of the minority, and debate matters of national interest if it's in the Commonwealth Parliament. It also acts to scrutinise the actions of government through question time, ensuring that these views and the work that it's doing is in fact reflecting the electorate, and that it is in fact responsible in its actions. The upper house in the Commonwealth Parliament is known as the Senate, and in the Victorian Parliament is called the Legislative Council. Regardless of whether it is the Commonwealth or Victorian Parliament, it acts as a house of review. In other words, it scrutinises the bills that are introduced by the lower house and identifies flaws and can make and suggest amendments. It should be noted that should an amendment be made, it must be sent back to the lower house. If it were the Commonwealth government, Parliament, it would be there to represent the interests of the states. So hence, it is sometimes referred to as the States House. If it were the Victorian Parliament, it's there to represent the interests of the provinces. So in this case, whether it be the Commonwealth or the state parliament, it's there to look at the collective rather than individuals. It also has the ability to make law, to introduce bills, with the exception of money bills, or those bills that are designed to raise and spend taxation. But it should be remembered that its primary role are the first two. These are the main two roles. It's probably also a good idea to be able to evaluate the roles of these houses, particularly that of the upper house. And you should consider, does it actually continue to represent the interests of the states? How effective is the House of Review? And that's going to be primarily dependent on who has a majority in that House and whether the parties vote along party allegiances.